Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving into the world of finance and power with the Rothschilds, as chronicled in Niall Ferguson's book, The House of Rothschild, Money's Profits, 1798-1848.
It's a fascinating look at this family's rise, from really humble beginnings to becoming a major force in European finance and politics, and it all takes place during a period of immense change.
Okay, so before we get into the specifics, can you give us a quick overview of the book? Like, what are the key themes that we'll be kind of unpacking today?
Absolutely. So Ferguson's book really focuses on the Rothschild dynasty's rise, starting with Mayor Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt, and then it branches out to his five sons, each of whom established banking houses across Europe. And the book highlights their innovative financial strategies, particularly their role in shaping the early bond market. It also explores the challenges they faced as Jews in a world that was grappling with emancipation and the persistent shadow of anti-Semitism. And of course, it delves into their complex relationship with political power, walking that fine line between supporting governments and maintaining their independence.
Wow, yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of layers to the story. So where do we even begin?
Well, we start in the late 18th century, a time when government finances were, to put it mildly, a mess. States were seen as unreliable borrowers, which made it really difficult for them to raise capital. This is where Mayor Amschel Rothschild enters the picture.
He was the founder of the dynasty. I think I read that he started as a coin dealer.
Yes, he started as a dealer in rare coins and metals in the Frankfurt ghetto. But his connections to court Jews, those financiers serving European royalty, gave him unique insights into the world of high finance. He learned how to manage money for the powerful, how to assess risk, and how to exploit opportunities that others overlooked.
So he wasn't just some pawnbroker. He had a real understanding of how money and power interacted.
Exactly. And he instilled these principles in his five sons, Nathan, James, Salomon, Carl, and Amschel. Each son was strategically placed in a major European city, London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt, respectively, establishing a network of banking houses that became the foundation of their success.
This network is often described as like their secret weapon. Can you explain why it was so crucial to their rise?
Imagine a world where communication relies on couriers and handwritten letters. Information travels slowly, and that creates opportunities for those who can move faster. The Rothschilds network allowed them to share information about market trends, political developments, and even military movements, giving them a crucial edge in a world where knowledge was power.
It's like they had their own 18th century internet,
Precise.
built on trust and familial bonds. I'm guessing this network was especially valuable during times of war.
You're spot on. The period between 1793 and 1815 saw almost constant warfare in Europe. And the Rothschilds quickly realized that financing governments, even those at war, could be incredibly lucrative. They weren't afraid of risk. They were masters of logistics. And they understood that in times of chaos, those who control the flow of money hold immense power.
So they weren't just bankers, they were strategic players on the world stage.
Absolutely. They financed armies, moved funds across borders, and even profited from fluctuations in currency exchange rates. They were pioneers in arbitrage, buying currencies where they were cheap and selling them where they were expensive, exploiting the inefficiencies of the early foreign exchange market.
Okay, so they were brilliant financiers.
Yeah.
But how did they navigate the political landscape? I mean, did they pick sides, play
No.
favorites?
They were incredibly shrewd in their dealings with governments. They understood that their loans, their investments, gave them leverage. But they also knew that becoming too closely aligned with any one regime could be dangerous. They aimed for a balance, supporting governments that promoted stability and economic growth, while maintaining enough distance to protect themselves if the political winds shifted.
It sounds like a delicate dance. Did they manage to avoid making any enemies in this high-stakes game?
They were not without their critics. Some accuse them of profiting from war, of manipulating markets, of wielding too much influence, and of course their Jewishness always played a role, fueling conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic sentiments. That painted them as shadowy figures controlling the world from behind the scenes.
Yeah, it seems like their success bred both admiration and resentment. But despite these challenges, they continued to thrive. What was it about their approach that allowed them to succeed where others faltered?
One key factor was their willingness to innovate. They didn't just follow existing financial practices, they created new ones. Take the bond market, for example. Back then, government bonds were often seen as illiquid and risky. The Rothschilds saw an opportunity to change that.
So they revolutionized how bonds were traded.
Exactly. They created a system where bonds could be bought and sold more easily, increasing their liquidity and making them a more attractive investment. This innovation essentially laid the foundation for the modern international bond market.
Wow. So they weren't just playing the game, they were changing the rules. This must have given them even more influence over governments, right? After all, if you control the bond market, you have a say in who can borrow money and at what
You're
costs.
getting it. The bond market became a barometer of political stability. Governments with strong bond markets were seen as reliable creditworthy, and therefore more likely to succeed. The Rothschilds, by controlling the flow of these bonds, could essentially make or break governments. It was a form of power that rivaled and in some cases even surpassed military might.
That's a pretty heady concept. Controlling the fate of nations through financial instruments. It's no wonder they became both indispensable to governments and objects of suspicion.
And their influence wasn't limited to finance. They understood that to truly secure their position, they needed to move beyond the ghetto walls, both literally and figuratively. They started acquiring property, building lavish homes that showcased their wealth, and signaled their arrival into the upper echelons of European society.
It's like they were building a world where they belonged, where their wealth translated into social acceptance and political clout. But despite their aspirations for integration, they couldn't escape the realities of being Jewish in a world still grappling with anti-Semitism, could they?
You're right. Even as they amassed wealth and influence, they faced persistent discrimination, social exclusion, and limitations on their rights. They were often seen as outsiders, as other, no matter how much they achieved.
So how did they reconcile their desire for acceptance with the harsh realities of prejudice? Did they try to downplay their Jewish identity, or did they embrace it?
That's where their story takes another fascinating turn. And we'll delve deeper into that aspect of their lives after a short break. Stay tuned.
All right, we'll be right back. We were talking about how the Rothschilds, despite their wealth and influence, couldn't escape that shadow of anti-Semitism. So how do they navigate this tension, between their desire for integration and the prejudices they faced?
Well, it's a complex aspect of their story. On the one hand, they sought acceptance from the European elite. They built these magnificent homes, acquired art collections, engaged in philanthropy, trying to fit into the upper echelons of society.
But at the same time, they were deeply committed to their Jewish heritage and community rights.
Absolutely. Their Jewish identity wasn't something they could just shed or ignore. It was a fundamental part of who they were. And this commitment manifested in various ways. They supported Jewish charities, funded synagogues and schools, and advocated for Jewish emancipation.
Sounds like they were trying to walk a fine line there. Striving for acceptance in the wider world, while also working to uplift their own community. Was this balancing act ever a source of tension within the family?
There were certainly differing views on how to approach this. Some family members like James and Paris were more inclined towards assimilation, embracing the cultural norms of their adopted countries. Others, like Salomon and Vienna, remained more deeply rooted in traditional Jewish practices and social circles.
So even within this tightly knit family, there were different interpretations of what it meant to be both Jewish and successful in European society.
Exactly. And these differences sometimes played out in their personal lives as well, particularly when it came to marriage. The Rothschilds, like many Jewish families at the time, practiced endogamy, marrying within their faith and often within their extended family.
The book mentions the story of Hannah Mayer Rothschild, who married outside the faith right.
Yes, her marriage to a Christian man caused a major rift within the family. It was seen as a betrayal of their traditions, a threat to their unity and identity. It shows just how important these cultural and religious bonds were to them, even as they navigated the complexities of European society.
It's a reminder that even as they amassed wealth and influence, they were still grappling with the same social pressures and cultural expectations that many Jewish families faced. Did this emphasis on family unity, on marrying within the faith, extend to their business practices as well?
Absolutely. The Rothschilds rarely took on partners outside the family. They believed that keeping the business within their tight-knit circle ensured loyalty discretion and a shared commitment to their values. This approach, while limiting in some ways, also contributed to their extraordinary success.
It's interesting how this commitment to family both strengthened them and created challenges.
Yeah.
We've talked about their financial innovations, their political influence, their social aspirations, and their Jewish identity. But what about their personal lives? What were they like as individuals, as fathers, as husbands?
Ferguson does offer glimpses into their personal lives, revealing a complex mix of ambition, familial devotion, and a deep sense of responsibility. They were demanding fathers, expecting their sons to follow in their footsteps, to uphold the family's reputation and expand its reach.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of pressure to live up to such a legacy.
It was, and this pressure sometimes led to conflicts, rivalries, and disagreements among the brothers. But despite these internal tensions, they remained remarkably united, recognizing that their strength lay in their shared heritage, their common purpose, and their unwavering commitment to the family business.
So even with all the wealth and power, they were still a family at the core, with all the complexities and dynamics that entails. We often hear about their financial acumen, their political maneuvering, but it's easy to forget that they were also real people, navigating the same human emotions and relationships as everyone else.
Exactly. And their story reminds us that success, even on a grand scale, doesn't shield you from personal struggles, family dramas, or the challenges of balancing ambition with personal values.
It makes them seem more relatable, more human, despite their extraordinary achievements. But their world was about to be shaken in a way that would test their resilience and adaptability like never before. The revolutions of 1848, a wave of uprisings that swept across Europe, challenged the very foundations of the old order. How did the Rothschilds, who had built their empire on stability and close ties to established regimes, respond to this upheaval?
That's where their story takes an even more dramatic turn. These revolutions weren't just political events. They were seismic shifts in the social and economic landscape of Europe. And the Rothschilds, deeply embedded in this landscape, had to adapt to make choices that could either preserve their position or bring their empire crashing down.
It sounds like a moment of truth, a test of their principles and their adaptability. So how did they navigate this turbulent period? Did they cling to the old order? Or did they embrace the winds of change?
Well, the responses were as complex and multifaceted as the family itself. Some, like Salomon in Vienna, were deeply entrenched in the old system and resisted change. Others, like James in Paris, saw the writing on the wall and adapted more readily, recognizing that sometimes survival requires compromise and a willingness to embrace new realities.
So even in a crisis, they weren't a monolithic entity. They had different perspectives, different approaches, and sometimes those differences led to conflicts within the family, didn't they?
Absolutely. The revolutions of 1848 exposed fault lines within the family, forcing them to confront not only external threats, but also internal divisions. They had to decide whether their loyalty to the family business, to their shared heritage, was stronger than their individual beliefs and political allegiances.
It's fascinating how this historical moment, this wave of revolutions, reveals so much about their character, their values, and the inner workings of this powerful family. It's like a pressure cooker, intensifying existing tensions and forcing them to make difficult choices.
And those choices had consequences, not only for their business, but also for their personal relationships and their place in European society. They had to navigate a delicate balance between preserving their wealth and influence, while also adapting to a world that was rapidly changing around them.
So we left off with the Rothschilds facing this turning point. With the revolutions of 1848 sweeping across Europe, you mentioned that their responses were kind of varied. Could you elaborate a little bit on how different members of the family reacted to this upheaval?
Yeah, it's a great example of how even within a close-knit family, you can have diverse perspectives, and faced with such dramatic change. Take Salomon in Vienna, for instance. He was deeply connected to the Austrian court. He'd thrived under the existing system. So for him, the revolutions were a threat, a disruption to the stability that had benefited him.
So he represented a more conservative approach, clinging to the old order.
Yeah, you could say that. He saw the revolutionaries as these destabilizing forces, a danger to the established hierarchies that had allowed him to accumulate wealth and influence. But then you have James in Paris, who'd had a different experience.
Right, because he'd already lived through the 1830 revolution in France, so he had a different perspective on things.
Exactly. He'd seen firsthand that clinging too tightly to a crumbling regime could be disastrous. He was more pragmatic, more willing to adapt to the changing political landscape. For him, the key was to protect the family's interests, even if it meant working with the new powers that be.
So you have this internal tension within the family between those who resisted change and those who were more willing to embrace it. How did they navigate these differences? I mean, did it lead to conflicts, to fractures within the dynasty?
There were definitely disagreements, heated debates, moments of frustration, but what's remarkable is that they managed to maintain their unity. Even amidst these ideological clashes, they recognized that their strength lay in their shared heritage, their common purpose, and their commitment to the family business.
So even in a time of profound upheaval, they held onto that core principle of family unity. But how did this play out in practical terms? I mean, did they compromise, make concessions to each other's viewpoints?
It was more of a balancing act. They didn't necessarily abandon their individual beliefs or political leanings, but they found ways to work together, to accommodate each other's approaches, and to present a united front to the outside world.
That must have required a lot of trust and communication, especially in a time when information traveled so slowly and uncertainty was so high.
Absolutely. They relied heavily on their network, on their system of couriers and coded messages, to stay informed and to coordinate their actions. And they also recognized that compromise was sometimes necessary to protect their overall interests.
But they were willing to bend to adapt, to make strategic decisions that might not have fully aligned with their individual preferences. It's a fascinating example of how flexibility and pragmatism can be just as important as conviction and ideology, especially in times of crisis.
And their ability to adapt, to evolve with the changing circumstances, is perhaps one of the most enduring lessons of their story. They weren't rigid ideologues, they were practical problem solvers, always looking for ways to secure their position and to advance their interests.
So even though they faced these internal tensions, they managed to weather the storm of the 1848 revolutions. But did these events leave a lasting impact on their approach to business and politics? Did it change their worldview in any significant way?
I think the revolutions were a wake-up call for the Rothschilds. They had built their empire on this assumption of stability, on their close ties to established regimes. But the 1848 uprisings demonstrated that even the most powerful institutions are vulnerable to the forces of social and political change.
So it was a humbling experience, a reminder that they weren't invincible.
In a way, yes. They realized that their influence, while still substantial, had limits. They couldn't simply dictate the course of events as they had sometimes done in the past. They had to be more cautious, more strategic, and more attuned to the shifting currents of public opinion.
It sounds like they learned that true power lies not just in wealth or influence, but also in adaptability, in the ability to read the signs of the times and adjust your course accordingly. Did this newfound awareness lead them to make any significant changes to their business practices or their political engagements?
They became more diversified in their investments, recognizing that relying solely on government bonds was no longer sufficient, in this rapidly changing world. They expanded into new industries, like railway construction, which offered both financial opportunities and a way to exert influence over infrastructure and transportation networks.
So they were still looking for ways to shape the world around them, but they were doing so in a more nuanced, more adaptable way. It's fascinating how this family, which had started as outsiders, as refugees from the Frankfurt ghetto, had become so deeply intertwined with the fabric of European society, with its politics, its finance, its infrastructure.
And their story, even as we reach the end of this particular chapter, is far from over. They continued to evolve, to adapt, and to face new challenges in the decades that followed. Their legacy is a complex one, filled with triumphs and controversies, but it's undeniable that they left an indelible mark on European history, shaping its financial systems, influencing its political dynamics, and challenging its social norms.
It's been an incredible journey, tracing their rise from humble beginnings to the heights of financial and political power. But as we wrap up our exploration of Niall Ferguson's The House of Rothschild, Money's Profits, 1798-1848, I'm left with a lingering question. What do you think is the most enduring legacy of this remarkable family? What lessons can we draw from their story that resonate even today, in a world that's vastly different from the one they inhabited?
That's a great question, and one that deserves careful consideration. I think their story offers several enduring lessons. First, it highlights the power of family unity, of shared purpose, and of a commitment to common goals. Second, it underscores the importance of adaptability, of recognizing that the world is constantly changing, and that success requires a willingness to adjust your course, to embrace new ideas, and to never stop learning. And finally, I think their story reminds us that power, whether financial or political, is never absolute. It's a delicate balance, constantly shifting. And those who wield it wisely recognize that it comes with responsibilities, with the need to consider not only their own interests, but also the impact of their actions on others.
Those are powerful insights, and they certainly resonate with the challenges and opportunities we face in our own time. It's been a privilege to explore this chapter of history with you. And for our listeners who are eager to delve deeper into the world of the Rothschilds, we highly recommend picking up a copy of Niall Ferguson's The House of Rothschild, Money's Profits, 1798-1848. It's a captivating read that offers a glimpse into a fascinating era and a remarkable family that left an indelible mark on the world.
It's a story that continues to inspire and provoke reflection, even centuries later.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the House of Rothschild. We'll see you next time on Books and Bytes.